Welcome to Sizzle Fantasy Sports, the channel with the most sizzling hot fantasy takes and analysis, presented by your host, Gavin.
Rodgers clean pocket, throws the middle to the end zone. Devontae, touchdown, and a dagger!
How's it going? And welcome back to the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and today is a video I've been waiting a long time for, and is something I'm really excited to make for you all. We are talking about one of, if not the most polarizing player in 2021 fantasy football, and he's a star, if not a superstar player at that. I am talking, of course, about Saquon Barkley, the chosen one running back for the New York Football Giants. Saquon, there's a lot of people who won't even consider touching him in leagues this season, and there's others like myself who are preaching that you need to capitalize on the insane value presented in front of us this season because of the concern and the caution associated with the aftermath of that ACL injury in 2020. So kick back, relax. We've got a lot to talk about today, but it's some information I think you'll find incredibly beneficial and useful for your 2021 fantasy football knowledge heading into draft day. So if you're new around here to the SFS channel, head down and click that subscribe button. I'd love to have you around here. Join the community. We've got a ton of awesome stuff going on this off season. We're going to start hopping into some live action stuff with some of you, my subscribers, in live streams, hopping in mock drafts with me and doing other cool stuff that's interactive and engaging for you all. Also, for a limited time right now, we've got the exclusive SFS Discord open and available. The link to that is in the description of this video. Go click it. It's free to join for now, but once we have so many places filled up in that, it's going to come at the cost of an SFS Gold membership, which can be found by heading to sizzlefantasy.com, which is currently at the bottom of your screen. So, once again, relax you all. It's going to be a good video, so let's get started. While I'm at it, I might as well give a shameless plug to our social medias as well. I breezed over them in the intro, but if you want to check those out, that's how you figure out whenever we've come out with a new video. Other than turning that bell on when you click the subscribe button, you'll find information, extra details, and sometimes exclusive content based off what we've got going on around here on the channel with myself and Eric. So, first of all, the big thing we got to address here is that ACL injury. This is the big bugger that's getting everyone hung up on Saquon Barkley. Obviously, you see it down there. RB 120 finisher and half PPR scoring for the 2020 season because he played a game and a quarter, a game and a half. He got injured against the Chicago Bears, and it was quite devastating. Obviously, he's been a player who's been picked super, super high in fantasy drafts throughout his entire career dating back to 2018. And last season, he was pretty much a consensus top 3 pick, usually going top 2 in virtually all scoring formats. So Saquon Barkley has been valued extremely high amongst the fantasy community just based off of his pure talent alone. This is a player who is in one of the worst and most toxic situations for a fantasy running back, and yet we still click the draft button on him at the number 2 overall spot. So why are we holding off on him now? Why are we suddenly reserving ourselves and not diving in and taking advantage of this incredible value that we've got with Barkley in front of us this season? So the ACL injury for Saquon back last season was a clean ACL tear. This is really important because it helps us know that Saquon is not going to have extra and additional issues with that knee and that he's not going to have lingering effects. Maybe there's been some significant talk about him getting off to a slow or clunky start. Yeah, I think that's to be expected here, and maybe that is the reality of what we come to. What can you expect for a player who hasn't played in 12 months? He's got to get the ball rolling again. That's going to take some time. I don't think he'll take very long, though. Saquon is a freakish human being. This guy is a supernatural talent, one in a generation. We don't find guys like Saquon Barkley walking around on the streets. This is a player that's going to come back and rehab and recover super well from this injury, and he's probably already done with that. I mean, he's obviously continuing to strengthen that knee and get those tendons and the ligaments down in his knee area strengthened and more secure so that he has a lowered risk of injury and is able to come back at the player that we know he can be. But another thing that's making a lot of people really concerned is that he didn't have surgery until over a month after the injury. And the reason for that is that his ACL surgeon and the guy that ended up performing the surgery on him was in the MLB bubble last season, and he was doing stuff with Major League Baseball So because of the COVID pandemic. So obviously it was a bit difficult for him to get out of there and perform a surgery on a player playing a different sport when he had very strict rules in place, wasn't able to come out and see Saquon and perform that operation until his duties, and he did his due diligence with the other, obviously, sporting organization that he's involved with. So Saquon had to be patient a little bit, but another reason they held off on that injury is that the ACL also had him have a MCL sprain as well. So they were trying to reduce the swelling he had overall in his knee. It makes that operation go cleaner. It makes the lingering setbacks and side effects reduced when the area of inflammation has decreased prior to having surgery. So these are things that all bode well for Saquon. And when we project this out into the future, his surgery date is going to be 11 months post the start of the 2021 NFL season. So he will have had 11 full months to recover from this ACL injury before he hits the field next season, before we see him out there in action. And this is an injury that's typically a 7 to 9 month injury time frame. And for a guy as freakish as I talked about already and as impressive as Saquon Barkley is, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look at Saquon and just realize he's different even from the rest of the elite talent out there on the field. We haven't seen a player with that much athleticism, explosion, and dynamic ability since maybe an AP or some other great running backs from NFL history. Barkley has an extra 2 months on top of the expected longest and most lengthy time frame for rehabilitation from this injury. So Saquon's had plenty of time. He's going to be out there on the field. There's been reports that maybe the Giants don't deploy him in a full workload to start the season off. Again, I already touched on this. This is going to be something where he's going to start off slow and clunky. No one's going to come in there. What did they sign? Devontae Booker from Las Vegas. He's not going to come in there and steal touches from Saquon Barkley. Devontae Booker is in a completely different stratosphere, far below a Saquon Barkley's talent level. He's nothing more than a reserve running back. He's a lesser player than even a Wayne Gallman who filled in nicely for Saquon last year post-injury. So there's been a lot of question marks, a lot of concern, and I understand it. An ACL is a significant injury in the sense that it has a long timetable for recovery because the ACL doesn't have a blood supply. It can't repair itself. You have to go in and do invasive surgery and whatnot to get that cleaned up and fixed so you're ready to go. Saquon's done with that. He's done his rehab. If it helps you at all, just remember his quads. The quad father, quadzilla, whatever. They're having all these debates right now. A.J. Dillon, Mike Davis, Saquon Barkley. Who's got the best quads in the National Football League? It's probably Saquon Barkley, and he does at least the most with those quads anyways from a production standpoint in fantasy compared to the rest of those players. So on and on here, I can talk all day about how comfortable I am taking a player like a Saquon Barkley, even with that injury risk aside. Because if we look back at another elite NFL running back who has come out and put up monster fantasy numbers post an ACL surgery, we have to look no farther than my RB1 for the 2021 season, Dalvin Cook. And I've been preaching Dalvin Cook over Christian McCaffrey for the last month or so now. And Dalvin Cook's a player we wrote off just a couple of years back here as an injury-prone player because of how much he struggled at the beginning of his career. Very similar to a Saquon Barkley who had... what did he have? A high ankle sprain and some abdominal issues. Saquon has had various nicks and dings on his resume from an injury perspective, all the way dating back to very early on in his career, just like a Dalvin Cook. And Dalvin Cook rebounded. He came back even stronger, and now he's looked at as one of the best running backs in the league. Post-ACL, he's had hamstring issues, and he's still talked about as one of the most explosive players in the league. Hence, why Saquon will come back just as good, if not better, than he was prior to this injury. Dalvin Cook played 4 games in his rookie season before he tore that ACL, and he came back and played 11 games the following season, where again, he had that hamstring issue, which was an unrelated injury, and that lingered around and caused him to miss those remaining 5 games on the fantasy football schedule, which obviously was missed for fantasy owners. But if you can get over the fact that he did not have any side effects from the ACL, and he was just fine. It was a completely different injury that came in and caused him to have a setback from his ability to be available on the field. That's what we got to get ourselves comfortable with here. The ACL is not going to be a significant issue this year for Saquon, and Dalvin Cook, the 2 years post that initial 2-year span where he had the ACL and the hamstring injury, have been 14 games in each of the last 2 seasons and one of the best running backs across the league, and especially from a fantasy perspective where he was absolutely dominant last year. So if Dalvin Cook and that connection gives you any sense of comfortability here with the Saquon Barkley, please take this as your first piece of advice. Pull the trigger on Barkley. I'll get into where the value is at here, and we're going along. We're going to start breaking down the Giants situation this season. So I touched on this very, very briefly, but the Giants were one of the most toxic situations for a fantasy football running back. And if you were looking, it's quite baffling to me that we kept drafting Saquon as high as we were when we looked around and frequently acknowledged all of the garbage that was a flaming hot dumpster fire of a Giants organization around him, and we kept smashing the draft button. I mean, whether it was Daniel Jones early on in his career, or whether it was Eli Manning at the very, very late stages where he was washed up and could barely throw the ball down the field, and it was basically the Saquon Barkley and OBJ show. I mean, I remember Odell threw a touchdown pass to Saquon Barkley. Like, come on. You can't have Eli throwing a touchdown pass. You have to have a receiver who's basically one of the most electric players we've seen in the last 10 years. Obviously, Odell's had his issues as well. But still, Barkley coming back here, he was in a terrible spot with the Giants for the first 3 years of his career. And last year, we started to kind of see them trend upwards, and this is starting to become a well-rounded football team. But we only got to see it for a game and a half, like I said. And the first matchup he had in the season was, at the time, the hottest rushing defense in the National Football League. The Steelers started out this past season on absolute fire. I remember watching that game. Saquon literally was getting touched the second he had contact with the football in the backfield, and he had dudes draped all over him, and he somehow managed to get back to the line of scrimmage or only lose a yard or two per attempt. And it was honestly impressive how much he was able to do with the little space around him and how crazy bad that line produced. And I think that something understandable here is that the Giants had a very unfamiliar offensive line set with each other. We didn't have a preseason. We didn't have OTAs last year. So they didn't have time to mesh. And chemistry is something that's a really underrated factor of offensive line play. You can have really, really, really good offensive linemen, but if they don't have time to play together, to learn a system, to become smart, because offensive linemen actually have to be very, very smart players to know when to pull, when to kick out, and whatnot, when to set down in the run game and wash out a defensive end. There's a lot of stuff that goes into being an offensive lineman, and especially when you have injuries and you're shuffling guys all over the board, that can at times get confusing, and a missed running block assignment can mess up an entire play. So Barkley was dealing with a disaster there week 1, but the one thing that sticks in my mind is he caught a pass out in space, and the instant he had more than 3 yards of breathing room, the dude took off and was an absolute terrifying sight to see in open space. So Barkley, he's such a good player. The talent is off the charts. This is a once-in-a-10-year type talent, like I said. But finally here, in 2021, the Giants' offensive line, we're returning Nate Solder from the COVID opt-out list. That's their left tackle. They're going to have increased production and playtime there. And again, I already talked about Barkley might have a slow and clunky start to a season just because he's getting back in the role of playing football. Nate Solder coming in might mess up that offensive line chemistry a little bit. But if you pair that with the fact that Barkley, maybe the first 2 weeks, he has a touchdown or two that saves his value and his upside, and then doesn't end up having a complete fantasy meltdown, but it gives him some time to get his back on the tracks here and into a consistent level of production. The Giants as well went out this season and made dang sure Daniel Jones had enough weapons to be able to be a competent quarterback with. They're going to figure out this season, is Danny Dimes the guy or not in New York? And this is a big deal because not only will the passing game hopefully see an uptick in production, I mean, they have so many weapons. It's like a laundry list of names at this point. Evan Ingram at the tight end position, Kenny Golladay, an acquisition in the free agent market, first-round pick Kadarius Toney. You've already got Shepard and Slayton there. There's a lot of players in space that will be catching passes this year and making plays. Kyle Rudolph, I believe, was brought in this offseason as well. This also means you can't put 8 guys in the box to defend Saquon Barkley. That was a frequent occurrence, and one of the most loaded boxes that we saw was teams playing the Giants because they knew that it was OBJ, Saquon, or bust. They couldn't do anything else. So They finally got help there. If Galladay's healthy and on the field, they've got themselves a receiver one. Kadarius Toney is going to be dynamic, probably used with a lot of gadget plays and space. They're going to use him as an explosive playmaker to try and create room in this offense. This is going to open up a whole new dimension that we haven't even seen Saquon Barkley have the opportunity to touch the tip of the iceberg with. He's never had a guy besides Odell Beckham Jr. in his offense to be a complement or to be an asset to him to help him have more room to run the ball. I mean, for a guy who's this crazy talented to have done what he's already done at this point in his career with literally being the only threat in his offensive core, that is insane to me. So we've talked about the Giants here. Danny Dimes is going to have the opportunity to just have to be a ball distributor. He doesn't have to do much more than that. It's going to be the Saquon Barkley show and get the ball in space and get players running, get playmakers out in open field, and try and get them to score and whatnot to get this offense moving. But if we look back at Saquon Barkley's previous production, that's another place where I think that it's very telling as to the success that he's going to have. In his rookie season, Saquon Barkley was insane, and he had some really impressive statistical categories that I don't think are respected or brought to light as much because I think it's just kind of associated with the norm. But when you put into context some of the things he did in that 2018 season, you really start to see just how good of a football player he is and why he's going to come back and do these things again this year with an even better situation, a stronger knee, maybe even more explosiveness because of how intense the rehab is for an ACL injury. Oftentimes, athletes come back even stronger. If we look back at the 2020 season, Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb were the two leading running backs with the amount of explosive plays that happen. Explosive play is defined as a rush, or it can be a reception too, of 20 or more yards. And Derrick Henry led all backs last season with 16, which is a very, very high number. That was actually really impressive. A stat actually was just posted by the NFL today while I'm recording this video that Henry has the most 15-yard plus carries of any running back in the last couple seasons with like 90 or something, which is absurd. And then Nick Chubb back there at 12. That's another really high mark. Chubb only played 12 games in 2020. That's a time or a video for another time. Nick Chubb's a very impressive back as well, but he is nowhere near the amount of upside that a Saquon Barkley has because while they're both incredibly explosive in the open field, Barkley not only sees more volume because he's got the backfield more to himself, but he also sees a receiving game as well that Nick Chubb tends to not be a part of in that offense. So they've got the top two most explosive plays of running backs in 2021 fantasy. Or 2020 fantasy, excuse me. If we look back at Saquon Barkley's first 13 games in 2018 with the New York Giants, he had 8 rushes of 40 or more yards. That's double what these two other players did with 20 yards. They were the league leaders with 16 and 12 with plays of 20 plus yards. Saquon Barkley in his rookie year, again, with little to no help around him, had 8 plays of 40 or more yards. That is crazy. Saquon is one of the most unique players in the fact that he has the chance to score with any touch he's given. 40 yards is a long ways. That's almost half the football field, and he did that in over half of the games he played that season. So Saquon he's just a different breed here. Derrick Henry is one of the players that finds space and gets in the open field more frequently than any other back. And the fact that he was able to get 20 plus yards 16 times, but Barkley was able to go twice that distance, half the amount of time, is beyond unique and something that is really rare to see here. A stat that I pulled and I found in an article here is that the only other players in NFL history to be able to do that and have 8 touches, or they had 8 40-plus yard carries in a season, were Chris Johnson, former Tennessee Titan, 2,000-yard running back. The only 2,000-yard running backs in NFL history all belong to the Tennessee Titans. Chris Johnson, in the prime of his career, was one of those guys. He was a special player and one of the most explosive people in the open field. He had 8, and Barry Sanders did as well. The other 2 names, and obviously if you know Barry Sanders, that's an impressive name group to be along with. If you aren't familiar with the Chris Johnson, who had a bit of a shorter time frame as a star in the league due to injuries and whatnot, Adrian Peterson and LaDainian Tomlinson are the 2 other names on that list. And when they had those 8 carries or those 8 plays of 40-plus yards, they won the NFL League MVP, and that is crazy. Obviously, the league has swayed away from the running back position, really even being in contention for this award. The league has turned into a passing game, and running backs are valued less and less as actual NFL roster holders. It's a quarterback's award now. We see a QB win the award on a regular basis, and honestly, it's kind of mind-numbing, but nonetheless, that just speaks to the magnitude of the talent the type of player has to have to do that, and the level of production that they can do, because LT and AP are two of the best running backs in league history and in fantasy history, and have put up some of the most ridiculous stat lines. If you can get a guy like Saquon Barkley who's doing that level of production for you, that's unheard of, and at a spot where we finally are going to crack into the value here. Saquon Barkley is being drafted roughly as the RB5 right now. The RB5. I promise you, if he matches or puts up anywhere near those AP and LT numbers in those MVP seasons, he's the RB1. Saquon Barkley is a league winner at the running back 5 position in fantasy drafts. Don't let him fall that far on your board if you're picking around that 6 to 7 range. Even if you're at pick 5, I'm taking Saquon Barkley every single time this year. We've got guys, Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Derrick Henry, all going before Saquon Barkley, and I get it. Maybe there's less risk, but you look at CMC, he played, 4 games last season? I get it. Barkley only suited up for 2, but what really sets McCaffrey apart from a Barkley? I know he's got a really great receiving upside. He gets work on the goal line, but that's all stuff Saquon does. And I think that anyone would tell you that as a raw talent perspective goes, Saquon's by far a better player than Christian McCaffrey, and that's no slight on CMC. CMC is a really, really good player. Really good. You put him up there in that top tier of guys. But he's not Saquon Barkley. And you look at the offense, and you can start nitpicking and critiquing, but the Giants' offense has put themselves right up there with the Panthers of the world. And if you're going to talk about, Danny Dimes and all the uncertainty about him, and maybe he fails to make that offense tick, well, look at CMC. He's got Sam Darnold. We haven't seen Sam Darnold produce franchise quarterback numbers in any year that he's been in the league, which, by the way, he came into the league at the same time as Saquon Barkley and was drafted, the very next pick after him. So, similar concerns here, similar risks. Alvin Kamara, RB1 last season. He was a monster. One of the best receiving backs in the league. He lost Drew Brees. We're looking at what now? Jameis Winston, Taysom Hill. It's just a fact that when Taysom Hill was in the lineup for the Saints last season, Kamara saw a reduction in his reception count and the amount of production he was getting as a receiver, which is the most valuable part of his game. So there's question marks with him as well. Dalvin Cook, I put him maybe, if you want to take a running back ahead of Saquon Barkley, make it Dalvin Cook. And that honestly proves my point here. As a guy who is also having that injury label associated and slapped all over his face in the fantasy market, he's come out here and become my favorite player for this 2021 fantasy season at the position. So if that goes to show you, or at least helps you connect the dots here as to why I think Saquon is such a great pick and a great piece to offenses this year and fantasy lineups, please go out there, draft him, make this a regular part of your mock draft routine. Maybe we see Saquon rise up in ADP this season, but the main thing I just want to show here is that the other running backs going ahead of him right now, yes, do they have RB1 upside potentially and theoretically? Of course they do. That's why they're being drafted that high. But I think that there's a situation where we've seen some of the best out of these players, and we've seen them have these insane production seasons, and we haven't really gotten that really great cherry on top performance out of Saquon Barkley for a full 16, now 17 game stretch. So I encourage you, please give Saquon Barkley a chance in your fantasy lineups this season. Go out there in draft day, be open-minded with him. I think that there's a lot of great things that can come from this. And if you go out there and take Saquon at that RB5, RB6 spot in the middle of your first round, that gives you league-winning upside. And there's very, very few players that can do that at that spot on the board. So Saquon Barkley, he's got my stamp of approval. I'm going to be preaching this one and hitting this one home hard the entire offseason. He is a must draft and a 100% league winner for me in 2021. All right, that was a lot, but if you're still here, thank you so much for sticking with me, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you haven't done so, make sure to give this video a like so other people can find it. and figure out just why Saquon Barkley is such a great option in the middle of the first round in 2021 fantasy drafts. So thank you so much for tuning into today's video. Remember, check out those social medias if you haven't done so. Join up that Discord, links in the description, and go check out sizzlefantasy.com where you can get access to the 2021 draft guide collection that I am frequently inserting and adding new draft profiles to, and more content and analysis for you to break down. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. It means a lot to me. I'll see you next time. Peace.